I created the idea for this video like several months ago now, and even made the thumbnail months ago, but then somebody beat me to it. Guess that's what happens when I take forever to get to things. But alas! Recently my channel has been heavily focused on the modern Naughty Dog games, Uncharted and The Last of Us. I thought, what better way to bring this little saga of videos to a close than by focusing briefly on the most recent outings of these franchises, the Uncharted movie from 2022 and the first season of HBO's The Last of Us. Well, I certainly can't think of one, so that's what we're doing today. It's no secret to anyone that video game adaptations and other mediums have had a troubled history. In the last 6 or 7 years, I'd say there's been a lot of wins in this field, but for the past 30 years or so, it's been quite the treasure trove of crap. Movies that don't really get the appeal of the source material or change all kinds of things to the point where it's not even about the video game anymore, as much as it is a cheap cash-in on a popular IP. But do I think video game adaptations are truly cursed? Definitely not. In theory, you can make anything work, just as long as the team behind it are fans of the original work, wanting to do it justice, but also serious enough people to want to look at it and be willing to make changes that benefit the medium it's going to be placed in. Something made by a total fanboy would probably suck because they'd be too obsessed with literally translating everything to the screen exactly as is, making something that doesn't stand on its own. But then people who don't care about the source material will just make whatever and please nobody in the process. As I said, recently quality video game adaptations seem to be more common, and I say the more the merrier. The Last of Us being one of the biggest shows of the year and the Super Mario Bros. Movie being one of the highest grossing animated films of all time will both have an effect in making sure we get even more quality game adaptations, no doubt. But I get ahead of myself. We are first going to talk about the Uncharted film from last year. The first project released under the new PlayStation Productions banner. This is an effort to bring iconic PlayStation IPs to other mediums. In 2016, Sony tried this with Ratchet & Clank, but the critical and audience response was so lukewarm that they got cold feet, until 2019 when they started up PlayStation Productions. Thus far, they've delivered Uncharted and The Last of Us with shows and movies planned for other PlayStation games like Ghost of Tsushima, Days Gone, Horizon, God of War, and even IPs like Twisted Metal, Gran Turismo, Gravity Rush, and Jak and Daxter have projects in the works. I hope all those things turn out well, as an enjoyer of many of the things I just listed. The Last of Us is a great reason to have hope. But then there's the Uncharted movie. This film was in development hell for years. The first rumblings of an attempt at an Uncharted movie were in 2008, when Uncharted 2 wasn't even out yet. Evidently, Mark Wahlberg was attached to the project as early as 2010. A whole 12 years before the film actually released. Guess they just never landed on a script that was good enough until recently. Cast and crew kept changing until they finally landed on the version of the film starring Tom Holland as Nathan Drake and Mark Wahlberg as Victor Sullivan. From day one, I, like many, thought casting Nate and Sully so young for the movie version seemed like a misstep. However, I still saw the movie opening weekend because why not? It could be fun. Before this second viewing, I haven't really thought about the film much at all, and that's what I want to examine. Is the movie good? Is it not? Does it succeed at adapting a game? Well, let's talk about it before going over and comparing it to the Last of Us series. Video games are an interactive experience, obviously, so that has been a consistently challenging element of bringing them to other mediums. How can you make these experiences that players actively engage with work in a medium where you don't do that at all? This especially goes for Uncharted because of the fact that I think Uncharted could be a really great movie. The fan film starring Nathan Fillion was a fun proof of concept for the idea. But what's working against an Uncharted film from the offset is that it is designed to be a video game, contrary to what those who haven't played it might say. Uncharted was heavily inspired by action movie blockbusters such as Indiana Jones. The idea from the beginning was to make an action game that feels like a blockbuster movie, so you have all the genre tropes and set pieces, but the appeal is that you play it in the game with some of the best technology the industry had to offer at the time of each game's release. So when you try to put Uncharted onto the big screen, you have to do a lot of work to really stand out because Uncharted used gameplay to do that in its original form, and that's the main area I think the movie falls short in. It just feels very generic. I appreciate a lot of things about this movie. For example, they showed us things the main series never did, like how Nate works as a bartender. I just thought that was funny to see because the original trilogy never, not even once, shows what it is that Nate does between all the depth-defying adventuring. Not like this is some major revelation, but since the movie has the ability to show things that the games don't, since there's no need for gameplay, you get that extra context on his character and what he's actually like. The story does not adapt any of the Uncharted games directly, which I think was a wise choice. I'm not sure if Uncharted 1's plot would really grab people outside of the gaming context for the reason I went into earlier. It was mostly a simple setup to give us cool action scenes you played. Uncharted 2 and onward grew in complexity each time, but you would need the context of the first game to do any of that justice. So instead, they told an original story that maintains core parts of the franchise's DNA, like focusing on a real lost treasure and having familiar set pieces and funny dialogue. The movie mostly evokes Uncharted 3 and 4 by showing a backstory with Nate and Sully like 3, and also tying in elements of Sam's story from Uncharted 4. Then in action set pieces, it uses those two games as a base, with a chase on rooftops and streets and a plane crash like Uncharted 3, as well as having an auction house scene and a pirate ship like in Uncharted 4. But I think those things all made for better gameplay segments than movie sequences. In Uncharted 3, I still get that pulse-pounding feeling when Nate's flying out of the crashing plane. When I watch it in the movie, I get kind of distracted by how quick the cuts are and how quickly each scene ends after it begins. Games can just have action scenes go on for longer periods of time than a movie, so I enjoy it more in the game. Jumping off of a cliff and using the rope to swing around enemies and drop on them will always be more fun to play in Uncharted 4 than it will be to watch in the Uncharted movie. But that's not to say people didn't work hard on it. While watching the behind the scenes of the film, I was surprised by the sheer amount of practical effects. That's not a CG Tom Holland in the plane scene. He's really jumping from box to box, and the boxes are being controlled by these gigantic robotic arms. He was put in a harness and spun around while hanging for dear life. Tom Holland and Mark Wahlberg both were doing action scenes themselves, and that honestly gave me more respect for the film than I had before. I genuinely assumed it was a giant CG fest by watching it, but seeing how they combined practical and computer effects made me more impressed with the final product. Even with that knowledge, though, it's hard for me to say this movie does much for me because, as I said, I think the set pieces that were inspired by the Uncharted games were more fun in the game. But when looking at the movie on its own, I'm still not utterly blown away, you know? Around when this movie was released, I was convinced I was losing interest in action movies because the big ones are so heavy on CG like the Marvel movies. And even when they aren't like this, I just think, it's all been done before. But then I binged the John Wick series before Chapter 4 released, and then you get blown away by how each movie topped the last one with inventive action sequences. John Wick 4 has multiple genre-defining scenes in one movie. It's not fair to compare any one movie to the apex of the genre, I get it, but John Wick now has me spoiled because I can still totally enjoy an action movie. Ones like Uncharted just didn't do anything special for me. This is hard for me to quantify because I totally appreciate how much effort went into crafting the major action scenes. I just have seen cooler stunts and camera work. I think the games are more fun than the movie was. Then, as a fan of the games, you scratch your head a bit at how they decided to adapt a character like Sully. He was the heart and soul of the franchise, but they decided to build the movie around this arc where he's a total dick and learns to put people before the treasure at the end. As you will soon see, I think changing things in an adaptation is totally fair game, but you want it to still have the core of the original. The game story showed Sully was always a good guy, as seen in the flashbacks from Uncharted 3 where he meets Nate. Am I saying it's different and therefore ruined? No, I'm just saying that's an odd difference and I don't really like it as much. The film takes you through narrative beats at a really fast pace and you don't really connect with the characters that much since there's a lot of action set pieces and quips. All being done by these new versions of Nate and Sully, where I can't help but feel like the characters were aged down a bit from the games for the purpose of marketability since Tom Holland is so big right now, which I guess paid off because the film earned back way more than its budget, which is good for them at the end of the day. No hate on Holland at all. I think the acting in this movie is good. He put a lot of energy into it as I showed before, but I just don't think it's uber compelling to watch. I think the movie's decent, I really do. I just think as an adaptation of a game, it's caught between a lot of different things. It's taking a game that's entire appeal is being a big budget action movie but placed in a video game and making that a movie. What makes it special is gone, and in its place you have action scenes that are neat and fun to watch and all, but you've seen better elsewhere, including the game itself. It's taking iconic characters and kind of retelling what we've seen before, but also doing a new story that isn't an exciting plot in its own, but also not a faithful version of the original. So I just think it shows off why adapting games is often a challenge. But after 2 viewings, I can say that it's well above watchable. Yeah, even after all that, I would still say I enjoyed it. It's definitely not one for the ages. I probably won't watch it again anytime soon because it feels kind of bland by action movie standards, but while you watch it, it has funny lines like when Nate's fighting the Scottish guy and can't understand him. The action is good and used a lot of practical effects and locations, which is definitely a plus in the modern movie sphere. It just doesn't do anything so special that it stands out or generates much conversation or buzz about Uncharted as a franchise for the non-fans. At least that was my experience with it, as people I knew who saw it weren't any more interested in the games than they were before. With the dynamics set up in this movie, I think a sequel could actually be really good now that the backstory is established. You can just jump into a new story that features the character interaction from the games we all know and love, which I think is for the better. The film earning so much no doubt means a sequel will be made, and I look forward to that and hope they take this foundation and do even more with it, since like I said, an Uncharted movie, even if it doesn't reinvent the wheel, could be a lot of fun. The potential for a video game adaptation really changing the conversation was shown to me as the HBO Last of Us was coming out. From the offset, I was a lot more excited about this than I ever was Uncharted. Neil Druckmann and Evan Wells were executive producers on Uncharted, but that usually means they didn't actually do much while it was being made. But for The Last of Us on HBO, it was being made by Craig Mazin, the showrunner on the incredible Chernobyl series that was also on HBO a few years back. And then Neil Druckmann played an active role in this series. I feel like having original creators on board for an adaptation usually leads to it being better off, off, since the heart of the story can still be there while also having a willingness to make changes or improvements. Also helps to have people like Craig Mazin involved who contribute great ideas and changes and just know what they're doing when creating a great TV show. A live-action Last of Us is a project that, like Uncharted, was in the works for a long time, but the right tone and medium were an issue until Neil met Craig a few years back. Unlike Uncharted, this was going to be a faithful adaptation of the first Last of Us, just done in a season of TV. That was the thing that had me the most excited because I think, as a general rule of thumb, that games with more story are better adapted as TV than movies. A movie's only going to be 2 hours or so. Squeezing in the right balance of story and action would be a challenge, but a TV show gives you several episodes to space out the story and do it justice. A plot like The Last of Us just couldn't be told in 2 hours, especially with how clearly segmented the story was between different narrative beats. It's definitely better suited for TV. To contrast with what I just said about Uncharted, The Last of Us series was a major cultural event. It was the show everyone was watching and talking about. It was a very surreal experience to see my favorite game dominate the pop culture discourse. But it was a breath of fresh air, to be honest, as talking about The Last of Us online these last few years was like injecting raw sewage into my veins, so it was nice to get to talk to normal people like my family about this game for once. People who barely know anything about video games. My sister, who has barely played anything besides The Sims in like 15 years, watched every week. Or uncles who used to play games but don't as much anymore who enjoyed the show. I have an aunt who didn't understand how this could have been a video game at all because her concept of a game was Miss Pac-Man. The series was meant to please the fans of the game that already existed, but also expose it to the millions upon millions of people out there who will never touch a controller in their lives. And to that end, it was quite successful, getting millions of viewers each week and being renewed for a second season pretty early on in its run. The point is, the show left an impact, and I will say why I think that is later. I could talk about the HBO Last of Us for hours upon hours, and in real life, I have. It was right there at 9 p.m. when every episode dropped with my popcorn ready and talked about it with as many people as possible. If I had the energy, I could probably turn this into a 90-minute video on the show alone with every observation I had, thoughts on music selection, and behind-the-scenes trivia for every episode as I listened to every piece of post-show content I could, but I don't want to be here all day. So what I'm going to focus on are the things that made this show really compelling, mostly by talking about the things it did that were different from the original story that enhanced the series for the TV format, and then say what I think makes it different than something like the Uncharted movie. This begins right at the beginning, as episodes 1 and 2 both feature these haunting cold opens that expand the universe. Episode 1 opening on this talk show scene from decades ago where one scientist warns of the potential world-ending danger that the cordyceps fungus threatened humanity with is a really compelling hook since I wasn't expecting it at all. When it cut from that to the theme music of the games and the opening credits, I knew this was gonna be great. The opening of episode 2 showed what it was like on the ground when the virus first started. When this expert alerts the government that there's no cure, no medicine for this, and that, as the guy said in episode 1, this is it. Humanity is done for if you don't stop the spread. In the game, when Joel and Tess get Ellie out of the QZ, they tell Ellie that the military bombed major cities to get rid of as many infected as possible, but it didn't really work. Seeing the human decisions that led to that was really impactful and added a lot to the story. Don't mean to repeat myself a ton, but that's the main takeaway from this series. But I'm still going to give my thoughts on each episode because, as I said, I have a lot of those. The game's pacing was pretty fast. It didn't really focus on anything longer than it needed to because of the fact that it was an action game, so therefore, the game needed to get the player to the next action scene or exploration moment. This never detracted from the story, but when you watch the TV adaptation, as early as episode 1, they were able to focus on things the game didn't have the time for. Joel's daughter, Sarah, is a character you see so much more of in the TV series and in the game, like her going to school, interacting with the neighbors, and fixing Joel's watch. Actually, seeing the neighbors when they were normal and then watching the old lady turn into a monster was way scarier than just getting the monster attack right at the beginning of the game. When the show cuts to 20 years later, it gets to focus on Joel's routine in the QZ, doing various odd jobs for ration cards like disposing of bodies in the flames, another thing the game didn't put much focus on. When the series isn't making changes that expand on the original story, it's doing scenes that are virtually one-to-one with the original. Craig Mazin put it the best. If they couldn't do it better than what was on the page originally, they weren't going to try and outdo it at all. So you get scenes like Sarah's death or the farmhouse argument with Joel and Ellie that are pretty much identical, while others are different and, in my opinion, enhanced. Like how episode 1's ending was this total glow-up. Joel, Tess, and Ellie still get cornered and scanned, but first, the guy with the scanner was someone the audience already was introduced to, making him a little more than a faceless NPC. But the episode puts focus on how Joel guarding a teen from a soldier with a gun in his face brings him right back to the night Sarah died, and he beats beats the guy to death because of it. While researching my video on the first Last of Us the other week, I found out that this was actually always the intention behind the scene in the original, but they made the emotions of it so much more readable than the original, where it just felt like action was all happening in the heat of the moment. The TV version uses this as a way to highlight how different Sarah and Ellie are from the start. Sarah was terrified of her dad killing the infected neighbor, but Ellie was mesmerized at the sight of someone enacting violence for the purpose of defending her when no adult has ever done that before. That much was new, but all these factors combined to make a much better scene than what was in it originally. Through it all, I did feel like the infected were pretty underutilized. In hindsight, you realize the infected were game enemies built for the purpose of sneaking around them or fighting them with little relevance to the actual plot, so they only appear in the series when they needed to. Episode 2 was appropriately titled Infected, as it's their biggest episode besides the big finale of Episode 5. The show introduces this concept that the infected are all connected by a hive mind that alerts multiple infected to the protagonist's location, but I don't feel like they do anything special with that outside of this episode. It sounds like it could be a neat gameplay mechanic, but is only in the version of the story that isn't a game. The infected aren't a threat in most episodes, but what they did in episode 2 was stellar. In the game, you can tackle multiple clickers in a single encounter, but in the episode, they made just 2 of these monsters supremely scary by making them incredibly resilient to bullets, and by having the characters emphasize that you have to be completely silent around these things, you're as good as dead. The first clicker is shown out of focus when they first get near it, and then it's not fully revealed until it's noticed the characters were in the room. It just made the infected have more presence on the screen when they do exist, even if it's not often. Tess dying against a horde of infected also felt more natural than the military just chasing the main characters for hours. I like how Ellie tells Joel it's not her fault that Tess died and that he can't blame her for it, which he agrees on. Since I played the game beforehand, I knew Ellie was just projecting because she absolutely feels guilty for Tess's death, but her putting on a brave face over it just made her feel slightly more real than when she put it all out there that she was sorry for it like what happened in the game. The story of The Last of Us, despite what silly people who haven't played it might tell you, was designed to be a game. The gameplay loop of looking around areas to find supplies and managing them with craftables and using your limited supply of ammo successfully was the core of the game. The characters and their relationships were there to enhance the gameplay, and the gameplay was also in service of the story. Both fed into each other. Because of that, many segments couldn't be included in the TV version. The whole segment of Bill's town was completely incompatible with the non-game format. The game builds a connection between the player and Bill by having his traps be obstacles you have to avoid first, and then having him help Joel and Ellie to reach a car battery. But if you remove the gameplay element of it, you'd be left with another episode where you watch Joel and Ellie and another character look around rooms, which was exactly what happened in the last episode, while Ellie and Bill exchange insults this time. It wouldn't have been bad, but they decided to do something much different. Naughty Dog Games, and I'm even talking about Jak and Daxter and somewhat Crash Bandicoot here, never cut away to scenes where the main characters aren't in it. But in this TV version, we get to focus on things that don't concern the main characters. Episodes 3 through 5 all put this to good use, as episode 3 first shows what Bill was like before the outbreak, being this doomsday prepper turned survivalist, which really put a smile on my face to see because it's so in character for him. Most of the episode was dedicated to the story of how Bill and Frank met and fell in love and how their life together went. I kept waiting for the tragic ending like what happened to these two in the game, but it never happened. Giving Bill and Frank this happy life was great. It told a story you don't usually see in this genre and clearly emotionally impacted many people, as this became the most famous episode of the season, I'd say. It's a complete story on its own, removed from the main story of the series, but when looking at it as a part of the larger story, the Bill chapter ends the same as it does in the game. Joel and Ellie get a car to traverse with, which was the point in the game. Just the path there was completely different. Bill in the game was a mirror of Joel in a negative sense. Canon Bill was what Joel would be if he didn't let Ellie into his life. TV Bill is what Joel will be if he does, showing that it's great because love and family are worth fighting for, but also can be scary because of what we might do for those we love. Bill's note to Joel pretty clearly foreshadows how this story is going to end.
I saved him, then I protected him. That's why men like you and me are here. We have a job to do, and God help any motherfuckers who stand in our way.
Also playing off of Joel's feeling of failure for the death of Tess, deciding to honor her final wish and take Ellie to the Fireflies himself, even somewhat enjoying her company on the way. The story of Henry and Sam was also a complete and total improvement. The raiders Ellie and Joel get attacked by have far more story significance, as the game only needed them to be enemies to fight. Once more, since we can cut away to other perspectives, you see the fall of Fedra in the Kansas City QZ and how this group is run while they look for Henry and Sam. After watching this, you look back at the game and just think it feels incomplete by comparison. I mean, Henry and Sam were survivors attacked by chance just like Joel and Ellie, but in the TV version, Kathleen, the leader of this group, has a vendetta against Henry because he sold out her brother to Fedra to save Sam. Henry and Sam were obviously a mirror for Joel and Ellie in the game, but now it's way more interesting because he's connected to the conflict at hand, and he had to make a choice to put Sam's life over everyone else because he loves his brother. More obvious foreshadowing for the end of the story. It was just far more compelling while still providing the same point and having the same tragic conclusion. Sam being made an 8-year-old boy who is deaf gives him and Henry a unique interaction, and it also makes Ellie more protective of Sam than when they were just same-age peers. So her guilt over Sam's death hits even harder for her. And then the conflict between Henry and Kathleen also foreshadows the arc Ellie will have in the adaptation of The Last of Us Part 2. As we're all egocentric enough to think our pain comes before others, which Ellie will have to confront in her conflict with Abby. Through all of this, Joel and Ellie are characterized in a faithful way. Pedro Pascal, one of the bigger stars right now, was cast as Joel, which was perfect. I mean, the second you look at him, you just think, damn, they got it on point visually. Then he does a great job with the material. Ellie is played by rising talent Bella Ramsey, who was also perfect in this. Craig Mazin said they auditioned hundreds of people to be Ellie, but the main issue was that Ashley Johnson as Ellie had such an incredible range of emotions that captivated the audience, but she was an adult playing the character. Ellie herself is a computer-generated image. Finding a kid to actually do that job was challenging. But Bella just really has it. She nails the funny scenes and the dramatic ones too. Of course, some weirdo freaks on the internet harassed her over being cast in this, but online, I guess that's as common as the sun rising in the east. She seems like a joyous person to be around though. But back to the show. Joel is still a hard ass in this series, but by episode 4, I was really surprised with the direction they took him in. It's built up in episodes 2 and 3 that Joel doesn't want Ellie to have a gun, so when she takes Franks at the end of episode 3, I just assumed that was going to lead to the hotel argument where Joel bugs out over her shooting someone. But instead, he just awkwardly tries to apologize for her having to save him at all. He also teaches her how to properly hold the gun so that she can use it in the event of emergencies. This just made Joel feel more real, as his getting mad at Ellie for this in the game just made him look like an asshole, even if he semi-apologized for it 2 minutes later. In episode 6, Joel still begs Tommy to take Ellie because he's afraid of losing or failing her like he failed so many people before, but having Joel break down to his brother about his true feelings here also makes him more human and also gives Pedro Pascal the chance to have a standout emotional scene in the season. Joel putting on a tough persona and trying to demand Tommy take Ellie in the game works because he's concealing his true feelings to that extent, but I think that only really works in a game because you play as Joel and thus you're connected to him even when he's being a jerk for no reason. TV Joel still acts cold and distant when Tommy says Maria is pregnant, so you get some of that, but the breakdown is just a much better scene than the brief argument they had in canon. Joel having this more honest moment makes it clear that he's just projecting when Ellie mentions Sarah and he decides to be mean to her in response. Unrelated, but I'm very curious to see where they're taking this plot of Maria and Tommy having a kid. I can imagine Tommy taking off to find Abby when he has a 5-year-old at home is going to bring in a lot of drama when he comes back a shell of himself and will foreshadow Ellie's decision to leave Dina and JJ to find Abby again. But that's still speculating about the next season. When looking at the material we have, Maria is another character who only got a bare minimum of screen time originally, and the show fills in the blanks in ways that feel really natural, like her not liking Joel based on reputation alone, or advising Ellie not to put all her faith in him. But still somewhat understands Joel's loss as she lost her own son a long time ago too. Placing episode 6 in the Jackson community from part 2 also builds a narrative bridge between the first season and where season 2 is going to start. It also allows them to just cut out all the action scenes from this part of the story. Joel's argument with Tommy or his argument with Ellie are cut off by the need for gameplay. The gameplay is a quick way to end scenes and get characters back to where they need to be after an argument. It's just kind of how it has to be in an action game. There needs to be as many action scenes as possible. But having Ellie and Joel's argument end with him slamming the door and then both sitting with the awkwardness all night and all morning just allows the emotions to rest and leads to a funny moment like this one.
You deserve a choice. I still think you'd be better off with Tommy.
Let's go.
In the finale of the episode, Joel's injury was changed to be a stab from a broken baseball bat. The rebar situation in the game is so outrageous in terms of survivability, but it needed to be that way because game characters can get shot and be fine by wrapping it up in a bandage. So to buy into an injury putting Joel out of commission for a bit required something big, but on TV where there isn't much action in most episodes, getting stabbed will do the trick. Episode 7, while good, is definitely my least favorite to rewatch. Placing Left Behind at its proper point in the story was pretty smart. The DLC has been a part of the game far longer than it ever wasn't, so in doing the adaptation they could just work in the DLC to space out the injury and the fight with David. Now that they know what's going to happen, the writers are able to foreshadow this DLC by having Marlene name drop Riley in episode 1 and starting a plot thread in episode 4 about Ellie having killed someone before then, which I thought was Riley, but they didn't show it in episode 7, instead confirming that at the end of episode 9. I think the episode version of Left Behind is actually more compelling compelling than the game was, because if I count it as a part of The Last of Us 1, then it's easily my least favorite part of the game, since you don't do that much besides walking around, so it's hard to replay. This episode is one of the coolest to see the behind the scenes for, like how this light up shot in the mall was actually CG, which I never would have thought. The production design in this mall absolutely looked fantastic. They filmed it in an actual abandoned mall too, which was super interesting to learn about. But when you basically follow teen girls in a mall for an hour, there are more exciting things to watch. I get all the emotions, like being a teen hanging around someone you like and not wanting to say it and all that. Like the game version, everything they want you to feel in Left Behind is there, and it's also required viewing because it informs Ellie's character based on what you've already seen her say about loss in the previous episode, and also shows why she fights so hard to stay alive in the next episode because she's not willing to let Joel go like she was forced to with Riley. So I think it's a good episode, but I'm just saying it's my least favorite because it's just the least interesting to watch. This was quickly made up for in episode 8 though, my favorite of the season by far. This was the highlight of the game, and the TV show really delivered. Focusing on the religious element of David was a smart choice. It was more of a background element before, but gradually seeing how much of a god complex he has while he uses religion to control his people and abuse them was just so gross to watch, but made for a really compelling villain. Everything I said I loved about the Winter chapter in my video in the first game still holds up in the TV version, with some good changes. I thought Ellie was a badass in the game version, but they added some small details to make her even more so. Like when David gives her food and the canon Ellie actually accepts it after he says it's not human, but then TV Ellie kicks it in his face anyway, rather starved than put one iota of trust into this creep. Then when she gets her big moment of killing David, my sister mentioned to me that it was a lot stronger for Ellie as a character to get up and keep going on and exit the building having no idea Joel is anywhere near there than it was for Joel to rush in while she's still tearing David's face apart. Something I never would have thought of before. Both versions make a point out of Ellie saving herself from David rather than Joel doing it as you expect, but her busting out of the building shows more strength than being rescued in any capacity. Though I did say, and still do feel like the music from the game scene absolutely should have been used in the reunion scene in the series. Not only because it's just great music on its own, but the score gradually taking over as Joel's dialogue gets completely muted was a great detail. It showed that whatever he was saying didn't even matter anymore. All that did was the two of them being back together. If the TV version still had that, I would have said it was better, but as it stands, I like both endings. But then the final episode was pretty straightforward, being the shortest one of the entire season. But I loved every minute of it. Including the backstory of Ellie's mother getting infected before she cut the cord as a plausible, albeit not realistic explanation for the immunity. But this isn't a series built on scientific fact anyway. Props to the episode for letting Ashley Johnson play Ellie's mother, that was a great detail. And also points to the series for including many of the game actors in cameos, like Troy Baker as James, or Jeffrey Pierce as Perry, or just getting Meryl Dandridge to play Marlene in both the game and the series. And while I'm on that note, it was also great of the Uncharted movie to give Nolan North a cameo. But more importantly, Anna lying to Marlene about cutting the cord before she got bit to make sure she wouldn't kill Ellie was an interesting parallel to how the episode ends. The point being, Ellie's parents, whether they be biological or adoptive, are willing to lie to keep Ellie safe. On that note, giving Joel and Ellie a chance to say "I love you" without saying those words was a good addition.
So time heals all wounds, I guess.
It wasn't time that did it.
I would go into more detail on what Joel said he was going to do after he lost Sarah, but is glad he didn't do, but I won't because I don't want to get demonetized. So I'll instead just talk about how I feel like the episode's shorter runtime was actually for the better. It just feels like an adrenaline rush from the moment Marlene says Ellie has to die all the way to Joel getting away with her in the back seat. Craig Mazin said before the series came out that the violence was going to be lessened from the game, making the point that killing enemies in a game is just meant to be fun, but you never think too hard about it after doing it. They wanted the show to have violence that left an impact. Didn't want viewers to be desensitized to it. Some episodes barely have action scenes at all. As the series went on, I thought everything from the more emotional Joel to the relative absence of combat was all leading to the final 2 episodes where you get a lot of it, and I was right. They did a great job not making Joel's run through the hospital feel triumphant. It doesn't feel like John Wick or other action movies where you just want to see some cool shit happen. In the game, it's easy to feel like Joel is on the back foot because you're playing as him and this is the final level, so it's gotta be the toughest part of the game for many players. So you inherently get a feeling of satisfaction for getting through it. But in the show version, they have Joel completely disassociate and become like the Terminator, blowing people away indiscriminately. It's chilling to watch, especially thanks to the score. Now as for Joel's choice, I still feel like it was fair of him to do this, but in the previous Last of Us videos, I've probably spent like 40 minutes plus on Joel's choice and the aftermath of it, so I'll spare you the details of my thoughts and just say this. I thought it was interesting how they changed some of the details of the lie. In canon, Ellie was completely unconscious for the entire hospital portion, but here it's established that she was conscious briefly, but Marlene and the Fireflies put her under without telling her what was next. Joel also says they had to rush out because raiders attacked, and that's why Marlene is dead. When in canon, Ellie never asks about Marlene, even though I'm pretty sure canon Ellie knew Marlene way better than TV Ellie did, not even meeting her until the first episode. I'm very curious to see how these changes to the lie are going to play out in season 2, but that remains to be seen. But since this script has gone on way longer than it needs to, what is my main takeaway here? Well, obviously, I thought the HBO Last of Us was magnificent from top to bottom. But to focus on it as an adaptation of a video game, I think it works so well because of the material it was adapting. As I said way earlier, I don't think an Uncharted movie couldn't be great. A sequel to the one we got will probably have a big leg up from the first one. However, Uncharted's main point of being a playable action movie makes it inherently less interesting than another medium. The Last of Us is exactly what you'd hope for in an adaptation of anything, really. It sticks to and gets the heart of the material while freely changing things that make the story better or just better suited for TV presentation. The Last of Us is a great game, and the way it was told was right for the game version, and the same goes for the TV show. But the reason why it worked so well has nothing to do with some weird talking point about how it was never trying to be a game, but instead, I think the reason it landed as much as it did with people is for the same reason it did when it was a game. It's because of the focus on the people. I think it's a very fun and well-designed game and a very well-made TV show, but the reason it sticks, and has had such a cultural impact both times, was because it got people to think about these ideas, like what would you do for the people you love the most even in the end of the world. It gets you invested in that discussion by showing you love in various forms throughout the story and then putting it to the ultimate test at the end when Joel chooses Ellie's life over the potential to save the world. When it ends, you think to yourself, oh man, is Joel the villain? Well, maybe not, I get why he did it, but was it right to lie? All kinds of questions like that. It's why the debate has raged on for 10 years since the game was released on PS3, and why the discourse in the series was so widespread because it, at its core, just touches people and gets them to think. Does a game have to have those things to be worthy of adaptation into other media? Definitely not. I thought the Mario movie and the Sonic movies, for example, were good fun, but I think the material itself is why The Last of Us did what Uncharted failed to do. Telling a story that stands on its own no matter how you present it, whether it's a game with resource management, crafting, and exploration, or passively watching it, or even just it being novelized would always have the same appeal. But that pretty much does it for me today. The video ended up being a lot longer than I'd hoped it would be, but I figured I'd give my full thoughts on the HBO Last of Us while we're here. And with that, the Modern ND retrospective is complete. I hope the people who watched it enjoyed it. There's a small video I want to do next, but beyond that, a big request is coming up as the next retrospective, so I hope everyone is hyped for that. And in the meantime, I'll say what I always do. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.